Rain cut into the graveyard like knives, the coffin lowering as mud swallowed the last proof of my husband's existence. And when I turned around there was no one, no parents, no brother, no best friend, not a single familiar face, just strangers shifting uncomfortably as if they'd wandered into the wrong funeral. And that was the moment I understood he hadn't simply died, he'd been erased. The priest spoke, but I didn't listen. My phone vibrated once in my coat pocket and the message was short and clean. Don't call us again, no explanation, no mercy, and I locked the screen before my hands could shake. That night the apartment felt staged. 2 plates on the table, cold food untouched, his jacket hanging where it always did, and I sat in the dark replaying my mother's voicemail telling me this was for the best. Her voice careful, rehearsed, like she was reading from a script written by someone else. At the police station the detective closed the file with practiced boredom. Heart failure, no signs of struggle, stress does strange things. And I smiled the kind of smile that ends conversations while my chest stayed perfectly still. I met my best friend the next day, watched her stir sugar into coffee she never drank, her phone lighting up with a name she hid too quickly, and when she said they were scared I realized fear had taught them how to lie without blinking. My parents wouldn't let me inside my childhood home, my father saying they warned me as the door closed softly, not slammed, just decided. In a dim internet cafe I traced money that moved like whispers, small, regular transfers from accounts I knew by heart, my family's, my friends', all flowing toward a place my husband had died trying to expose. In a storage unit I found his contingency, his voice calm on a recorder telling me to trust no one closest to me, and in a glass office high above the city a man with power in his smile admitted my husband asked dangerous questions, that people make choices and I told him so do I. Back home I built the truth on my wall, faces, dates, numbers, betrayals, my husband at the center, a confession beneath his photo, and when an unknown voice finally warned me to stop digging or join him, I answered without raising my voice, too late. As the room went dark and the map stayed glowing, waiting. The days after that began to blur into a pattern only I could see, a quiet rhythm of observation and preparation, because revenge isn't loud when it's real, it's patient. It breathes slowly, it waits for people to expose themselves. I stopped calling anyone, stopped posting, stopped existing in ways that could be tracked, and the silence made them careless. I watched my brother's social media resurrect itself. After weeks of mourning he never attended, new photos, forced smiles, expensive places he couldn't afford before. And I noted the timing, the locations, the people who stood just outside the frame. I followed my mother's routine from a distance, the same grocery store, the same pharmacy, the same church she prayed in while pretending she hadn't traded her soul for comfort. And I saw how often she checked her phone now, how jumpy she'd become, like guilt had given her a nervous system of its own. At night I replayed my husband's recordings, not just the warnings but the fragments, the half-finished thoughts, the pauses where he'd stopped himself because he didn't want to scare me. And each pause told me more than the words ever did. He had trusted my family once, trusted my best friend, and that trust had been sold piece by piece until there was nothing left but his body on a hospital bed and an empty space beside me at the grave. I started small because big moves attract attention, and attention was the one thing I couldn't afford yet. Anonymous tips to tax offices, compliance departments, internal auditors, nothing dramatic, just enough to trigger reviews, enough to freeze accounts temporarily, enough to make people nervous. I watched Lena cancel trips, watched my brother argue with bank clerks, watched my parents whisper behind closed doors when letters with official logos arrived. None of them called me, and that hurt more than I expected, but it also confirmed what I already knew, whatever they'd done. It was big enough that facing me felt more dangerous than losing me forever. I began recording everything. Conversations in public places, reflections caught in glass, timestamps aligned with lies, building a second wall in my mind parallel to the one glowing in my apartment. This wasn't about rage anymore. It was about clarity. About restoring balance to a world that had tilted quietly while I wasn't looking. One evening I followed Lana after work, keeping enough distance to be forgettable, watching her enter a building she'd never mentioned, an office space hidden above a closed bookstore, and when she came out an hour later her face was pale, her confidence stripped down to something raw. She leaned against the wall like she might be sick, and for a second I almost stepped forward, almost reached for the version of her I used to know, but that version was dead too, buried without flowers. Instead, I photographed the man who walked her to her car, his watch, his shoes, the way he avoided cameras without looking for them, and later that night his name slid into place on my wall like it had always belonged there. Connections began to thicken, lines overlapping, patterns emerging that no one wanted to see unless they were willing to lose everything. Sleep became optional. When I did close my eyes, I dreamed in fragments, hospital lights, rain on fresh dirt, my husband's voice cutting off mid-sentence, and I learned how to wake without gasping. How to function with grief folded neatly inside me like a hidden blade. I met with a journalist under a fake name, tested her instincts with half-truths, watched how carefully she listened, how she asked questions that didn't sound like questions at all. I didn't give her anything yet, but I planted curiosity, and curiosity has a way of growing teeth. At the same time I scheduled therapy sessions I never attended, letting the missed appointments create a paper trail of instability, because sometimes the safest place to hide is behind an assumption people already want to make about you. The man in the glass office began to move faster after that, his company reshuffling executives, issuing vague statements, sacrificing small players to protect the core, and I knew that meant pressure was working. I received another call late one night, this one not threatening, just tired, offering money, closure, a chance to move on, and I listened politely until he ran out of words. When he stopped, I said my husband's name, just once, and the silence on the line told me it still had power. After that, the calls stopped altogether, which was almost worse, because quiet from people like him meant meetings were happening where my absence was being discussed. My parents finally reached out through a lawyer, a formal request for mediation, framed as concern for my mental health, and I agreed immediately, because nothing scares guilty people more than someone who says yes too quickly. I sat across from them in a neutral office, watched my mother cry on cue, watched my father avoid specifics, watched the lawyer flinch when I asked simple questions about dates and signatures. I didn't accuse, didn't raise my voice. Just let the gaps hang in the air until they rushed to fill them with contradictions. When the meeting ended, my mother tried to hug me and I stepped back, not dramatically, just enough, and the rejection landed harder than any accusation ever could. Back at home, I reorganized the wall, removing emotion, refining it into something surgical, because feelings are messy and plans require precision. I backed everything up in multiple places, encrypted, time-locked, set to release under conditions no one else could predict, and for the first time since the funeral I felt something close to control. The unknown voice called again. Calmer now, almost respectful, telling me there were bigger forces at play, that my husband had crossed lines meant to protect people like me. And I asked him why protection always looked like bodies on tables and families torn apart. He didn't answer that, and when the call ended I knew the game had shifted from warning to negotiation. On the anniversary of my husband's death, I returned to the grave alone, placed nothing on it, said nothing out loud, because words felt unnecessary between us now. As I turned to leave, I noticed a car parked too long at the edge of the cemetery, engine off, windows dark, and I smiled faintly, not because I felt safe, but because being watched meant I mattered again. That night an envelope appeared under my door, no return address, just my name written carefully. Inside it copies of documents I already had and one I didn't, a missing piece that explained why my family had been so eager to disappear the day I needed them most. I sat on the floor until dawn holding that paper, listening to the city wake up, knowing that once I used it there would be no way back to the person I used to be. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the betrayal, something steady and cold finally settled into place. By the time the sun climbed high enough to burn the fog off the windows, I had already memorized every line of the document, every signature, every deliberate omission. And what hurt most wasn't the scale of it but the intimacy. The way my husband's death had been treated like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a life stolen. I burned the envelope in the sink, watched the paper curl and blacken, because evidence doesn't need to exist in one place to be real. And then I went outside and let the city see me again, just briefly, just enough to reset expectations. I answered emails with polite delays, returned a few calls with practiced exhaustion, allowed myself to be spotted buying groceries and standing in line like a person whose biggest problem was choosing between brands, and the watchers relaxed, mistaking visibility for weakness. Behind that mask I moved money the way my husband had taught me, quietly, legally, through channels designed for people who believed rules were optional, and I watched as the first domino tip, a minor executive resigning, for personal reasons, a charitable foundation pausing donations pending review, a rumor sliding into the business pages that hinted at more without ever naming names. I met the journalist again. This time in daylight, this time with coffee I actually drank, and I told her a story that was true but incomplete, a story about a woman abandoned at a funeral, about institutions that close ranks, about how silence can be purchased. And I watched her eyes sharpen as she realized the shape of it. She didn't ask for proof, she asked for time. And that was how I knew she was the right one. My brother tried calling that afternoon, left a voicemail full of nostalgia and nothing else, talking about childhood memories like they were currency he could still spend, and I deleted it without listening to the end. At night, the storage unit became a kind of chapel. The only place I allowed myself to miss my husband openly, touching the boxes like they were bones, listening to his voice until it felt less like loss and more like instruction. The man from the glass office sent an intermediary, a woman with impeccable posture and eyes that missed nothing, who suggested a settlement that would protect everyone involved. And I agreed to meet her in a hotel lobby full of mirrors. She talked about reputations and futures and the dangers of obsession, and I let her talk, counting the reflections, noting who lingered too long, who pretended not to look. When she finished, I asked her if she had ever stood alone at a grave while the people who raised her pretended she didn't exist, and the flicker in her expression told me she had, which almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. I left without shaking her hand, and by the time I reached the street my phone buzzed with a message that confirmed my guess pressure was being applied elsewhere. Quietly, desperately. My parents' lawyer called again. More urgent now, asking for another meeting, mentioning misunderstandings, reconciliation, and I agreed again because urgency makes liars sloppy. This time my father spoke too much, my mother too little, and when I slid a single page across the table, not the whole truth, just enough of it, the air left the room like a punctured lung. They didn't deny it, they reframed it, talked about safety, about being told my husband was dangerous, about believing they were protecting me from something worse. And I listened without interrupting because every justification added another layer to the structure I was building. When it was over, my father asked me what I wanted, and I told him I wanted the truth to exist where it couldn't be buried, and he nodded like that was something he could understand, even if he couldn't accept it. The car at the cemetery returned more often after that, sometimes following me, sometimes parked where I would notice it just enough, and I made no effort to avoid it, because fear only feeds what's hunting you. I changed my routines anyway, learned new routes, new faces, new places to disappear for hours at a time, and the city accommodated me like it always does for people who know how to blend. I set deadlines no one else knew about, triggers tied to events that would look random from the outside, and I slept better knowing that even if I vanished, the story wouldn't. Lena finally broke, showing up at my door after midnight, mascara smeared, voice shaking, begging me to stop whatever I was doing before it was too late, and I let her talk until she collapsed into sobs on my couch. She told me about the first meeting, the promises, the fear, how small compromises had turned into obligations she couldn't escape, and when she finished I handed her a glass of water and told her to go home, because confession doesn't equal absolution, and she left looking lighter and more terrified all at once. The journalist sent a draft outline, careful and restrained, and I marked it up with notes that guided without exposing, shaping a narrative that would survive scrutiny. And when she asked me what would happen if it all came out, I said people would pretend they were shocked and then go on with their lives, which was fine, because shock wasn't the goal, accountability was. Another call came from the unknown voice, this time naming names, offering cooperation, hinting at sacrifices that could be made to contain the damage, and I listened until he ran out of leverage. When he asked me what I wanted in return, I told him I wanted the machine to feel the cost of running over one man. And the line went quiet long enough that I imagined him weighing that sentence like a threat. On a cold evening that felt like a hinge in time, I stood in my apartment and took down my husband's photo from the center of the wall, not because I was done, but because the wall no longer needed a focal point. It had become a system. I replaced it with a clock, its ticking loud in the silence, each second a reminder that timing mattered more than speed. Outside, footsteps paused, resumed, paused again, and I knew the watchers were closer now, closer than they'd been before, which meant the next move would force a choice. I sat at the table, hands steady, phone face down, the city's lights flickering like a map of nerves. And when a knock finally came, soft, deliberate, unmistakably intentional, I didn't flinch, because whatever waited on the other side had already been accounted for. I waited 3 full seconds before standing. Not out of fear, but out of discipline, because rushing is how people give themselves away. And when I opened the door, there were 2 men I didn't recognize and one I did. My father's lawyer, suddenly smaller without a desk between us. His smile tight, apologetic, already negotiating in his head. They didn't step inside, they didn't have to. He spoke softly about concern, about escalation, about how situations like this could spiral if emotions weren't managed, and I listened with the same patience I'd practiced everywhere else, nodding once, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch until one of the men shifted his weight. When I finally spoke, it wasn't to them. It was to myself as much as anyone, because saying the truth out loud has a way of anchoring it. And I told them I wasn't emotional, I was informed. And that was the point where the conversation ended without anyone officially ending it. After they left, I didn't check the locks, didn't peer through the blinds, didn't call anyone, because paranoia is just another leash. And I'd already slipped mine. Instead, I packed a small bag with things that looked ordinary and weren't, documents hidden inside novels, cash folded into pockets of clothing I rarely wore, a phone with no history and no future. And I left the apartment exactly as it was, wall intact, clock ticking, like a set waiting for actors who might never return. I walked for an hour through parts of the city where grief blended in, where no one looked twice at a woman moving with purpose. And when I finally stopped, it was in a place my husband and I once joked about running away to. A coincidence I chose to believe in because belief can be useful. From there, I watched the fallout begin to ripple, subtle at first, a cancelled conference, a delayed merger, a resignation framed as health-related, and each headline felt like a pressure gauge moving closer to red. The journalist called with a question she couldn't put in writing, asking if she was ready to publish, and I told her readiness was a luxury no one ever really had, but timing was everything, and we weren't there yet. She trusted me, which was either brave or foolish, and I respected her for it either way. Lena sent a message she deleted before I could read. My brother sent another voicemail he pretended was about family but was really about money. And my parents went quiet in a way that suggested prayer or planning, possibly both. The intermediary woman returned, this time without polish, meeting me in a place that smelled like old coffee and compromise. And she dropped the pretense, told me the machine was nervous, that people higher up were asking why one death had turned into this much noise. I asked her if she wanted an answer or a solution, and when she hesitated I knew she wanted both but deserved neither. She warned me about consequences, about how truth doesn't always land where you aim it, and I told her consequences were the only honest currency left. We parted without agreement, which in its own way was an agreement. At night, I listened to my husband's voice one last time, not for guidance but for closure, and when the recording ended I didn't replay it, didn't need to, because his work had outgrown the sound of him. I sent a package to a secure location, scheduled to open under conditions no one but me understood, and then I did something reckless by most standards. I rested. Not sleep exactly, but stillness, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts without them tearing at you. And in that stillness I felt grief again, sharp and clean. Not as a wound but as a reminder of why I couldn't stop now. The car followed me again the next day, closer than before, bold enough to be obvious, and I let it, even waved once in a way that suggested ignorance or arrogance. Because uncertainty unsettles people who rely on control. A new face appeared in the periphery of my life, someone introduced as a fixer, someone who spoke in hypotheticals and assurances. And I listened because fixers often reveal more than they intend when they think they're in charge. He talked about containment, about narrative management, about letting the past stay past. And I asked him if he knew the difference between a past and a cover-up. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. The journalist sent a single word that night, green, and I stared at it longer than I expected, aware that once the first piece went live there would be no more slow turns, no more gentle pressure, just momentum. I drafted messages I might never send, to my parents, to my brother, to Lena, not to forgive or accuse but to mark the moment, and then I deleted them all, because history doesn't need footnotes written in regret. Instead, I wrote one email to myself, time-stamped, factual, outlining what I knew and what I suspected, and scheduled it to send to multiple recipients if certain conditions weren't met, a quiet insurance policy against disappearance. On the morning of publication the city felt unchanged, buses running, people arguing into phones, coffee spilling on sidewalks, and I moved through it like a ghost with weight, aware that entire systems were about to feel a disturbance they couldn't trace back to a single hand. My phone buzzed constantly, unknown numbers, blocked IDs, messages ranging from pleading to furious to carefully neutral, and I didn't answer any of them, because silence at that moment was louder than anything I could say. Somewhere meetings were being called, decisions rushed, sacrifices nominated, and I imagined the machine turning on itself, teeth grinding, and for the first time since the funeral I allowed myself a thin, private smile. By evening the knock came again, harder this time, not patient, not polite, and I didn't open the door immediately. Not because I was afraid but because I wanted whoever stood there to feel the weight, to understand that control had shifted. I checked the clock on the wall in my mind, felt the weight of everything set in motion, and when the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of a key testing a lock that no longer mattered, I stepped back into the shadows, steady, listening, knowing that the next moments would decide how many truths would survive the night. The door finally creaked open, not with hesitation but with intention, and the figure standing there was neither the lawyer nor the fixer I had seen before. It was my father, alone, a man who had always measured himself by appearances, by control, by the illusion of order, now exposed to the rawness of consequences. He didn't speak at first. His eyes flicked to the wall, to the photos and documents that told a story he had tried to rewrite with silence and avoidance, and I waited calm, letting the weight of his guilt settle between us like dust. He swallowed, a sound loud in the still apartment, and I knew then that fear wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came as quiet realization. "You're finished, aren't you?" he asked finally, voice brittle. I shook my head slowly. "Not finished. Corrected, balanced. That's all this is." He tried to step inside to bridge the gap between the past and the present, but I moved aside, letting him hover. "Understand," he said, voice cracking. What you've done, this isn't revenge. This is destruction." I let him see the truth in my eyes. Destruction. No. Destruction is what you did when you left a man to die alone, when you let the people closest to me vanish the day I needed them most. I'm just delivering what was owed. Nothing more, nothing less. He trembled slightly, the old posture of authority broken, the mask of certainty shattered. Behind him the city stretched endless and indifferent, but inside these walls every lie, every omission, every small betrayal he had cultivated over decades now had a witness, and that witness was me. You can't take it back," he said. Even if you wanted to." I smiled faintly. "I don't want to take anything back. I want it acknowledged. That's all." He tried another approach, the one he used when bargaining could protect him, when smooth words might undo the impact of his actions. "Think of your family. Think of your brother, your mother. Think of Lena. You're isolating yourself. You're losing yourself in this. Come back to them. Come back to life." I stepped forward, close enough to see the quiver in his hands, to feel the weight of his past pressing like gravity, and I said quietly, deliberately, "I lost him. I've already lost myself. What I've built isn't isolation, it's understanding, it's clarity, and it's justice." He stumbled back, shaking his head. For the first time, he looked less like my father and more like someone who had failed at every measure he valued. I turned away from him, moving to the wall that had guided me through months of planning, investigation, observation, and manipulation. The clock ticked steadily above it, marking the rhythm of what had been set in motion. Every line, every photograph, every document pinned there was a story, a chain of events, a record of who had acted and who had failed, and now every domino was about to fall. I had arranged the journalist's pieces meticulously. When they went live, every person who had ignored, abandoned, or betrayed would see their actions reflected back in a form that could not be denied or evaded. Companies faltered, reputations cracked, financial chains unraveled. My mother's charity network was audited, my brother's dealings exposed, Lena's silence cataloged in ways she could not explain away. The machine roared, but it roared in chaos of its own making, not mine. I was patient, I was calm. I had orchestrated it so that their panic would reveal everything. The pressure escalated quickly. Calls, meetings, heard apologies, desperate cover-ups, none effective. Each reaction became evidence, each slip another confirmation of the patterns I had seen but they believed hidden. And through it all I moved like a shadow, untouched, unseen, yet present in every calculation, every revelation. Finally, the night arrived when the last player, the one who had tried to warn me, to stop me, to control me, reached out again. His voice was measured, almost conciliatory, though the undertone was fear, and I listened calmly while he offered settlements, threats, bribes, even apologies that smelled faintly of manipulation. I weighed his words, listened for cracks, pauses, the subtle cues that revealed weakness. When he finished, I replied with 3 words that ended the negotiation: too late, always. After that, silence fell, heavy and complete. My father remained in the apartment for a brief moment longer, then left, unable to reconcile himself with what he had allowed to happen, with what I had accomplished. Lena called, but I did not answer. My brother tried to visit, but the doors stayed closed. My mother sent messages, careful, rehearsed, every word measured, but they were empty. Their presence mattered only as a reminder of the lives they had chosen to ignore. Alone, I returned to the wall. It was no longer just a record, it was a map of truths, of accountability, of consequences. I traced my fingers along lines connecting people and actions, names and events, and felt the weight of months of planning and patience settle like cold steel in my chest. The clock ticked steadily above it, marking not only the passage of time but the inevitability of what had been set in motion. The city beyond the windows continued unaware, indifferent, yet in its subtle rhythms I could feel echoes of the chaos I had released. Boards had shifted, lives had bent, decisions had been forced, and every movement had followed the path I had anticipated. The balance had been restored, not through anger or blind rage, but through strategy, observation, patience, and the quiet accumulation of proof. I finally allowed myself to sit, to rest fully for the first time since the funeral. The grief was still there, raw and jagged, but it had transformed into purpose. I closed my eyes and for a moment imagined my husband beside me, not speaking, just watching, approving. Every step I had taken, every calculation I had made, had been to honor him, to ensure that the truth could no longer be ignored, that betrayal could not hide, that justice, however quiet or subtle, would be fulfilled. By dawn, the city would awaken to headlines they could not ignore, to revelations that could not be denied. My father, my mother, my brother, Lena, all would feel the consequences of their choices in ways that extended beyond embarrassment or discomfort, in ways that required acknowledgement and accountability. And I would remain unseen, calm, untouchable in my resolve. Because revenge is not loud, it is patient, deliberate, and enduring. I stood at the window, watching the first light strike the rooftops. The wall behind me remained, clock ticking, photos pinned, connections drawn, documents stacked, silent testimony to the months of quiet preparation. I exhaled long and steady, and finally, for the first time, I allowed a small smile to surface, not from triumph, not from malice, but from clarity. The story had reached its conclusion, not with violence, not with theatrics, not with a scream, but with the weight of truth pressing against lies until they fractured and fell apart on their own. And though the city outside would continue unaware, I knew the balance had been restored. The people who had abandoned, ignored, and betrayed could no longer hide in shadows. They had been confronted by consequence, and consequence had been delivered with the precision of months of careful, patient work. I turned from the window and walked back to the wall, tracing the final lines once more. Every domino had fallen. Every truth had been revealed. The room was quiet, the clock ticked, the city hummed. And in that stillness I felt the presence of the man I had loved, the husband I had lost, his voice guiding me not with instructions but with approval. I closed my eyes, breathed in the silence, and knew that while revenge had been the path, justice, measured, unflinching, and inevitable, was the destination. The past had been confronted, the guilty exposed, the balance restored. And in that quiet triumph, I finally understood that true power lies not in destruction but in the patience to see truth fulfilled, no matter how long it takes, no matter how carefully it must be executed. The apartment remained calm. The city awake, the wall a testament to strategy, and I finally allowed myself to step away, knowing the story had ended, the debts had been paid, and the quiet satisfaction of justice would endure longer than anger ever could.